I think we have about 25 minutes to fix the democracy, so let's get right to it. It was great to have Preet up here talking about at the end what citizens can do to feel like they are more engaged and to have a more responsive democracy. You guys are all experts in your respective fields. DeNora, I want to start with you first because you do so much work with young people. It feels like the bedrock of a participatory democracy is civic engagement and an understanding of civics in general. And yet when you think about people in high school, for example, civic education is not a formalized part of a lot of high school curricula. Where, in your experience, do young people get their education about how government is supposed to work?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I think it's a great question to jump right in with, especially after hearing Preet's comments, because we all think about civic engagement as the act of voting, right? It's the one thing that we talk about all the time, and I am fortunate to lead the New York City site of Generation Citizen, which is a national nonprofit really focused on how do we strengthen our democracy by getting civics education back into schools and teaching the young people, so we focus on 12 to 19-year-olds, so middle and high school students, the fundamental civic knowledge and skills they need to participate in a 21st century democracy. To your question, Alex, in this moment, we know that young people are more likely to believe that they can do good by volunteering at a soup kitchen than they are by engaging directly with politics. And so we have to teach them, remind them that civics is not a dirty word, that they can be engaged in politics, and that it's there for them. We have to tell them, teach the young people who believe that living in something other than a democracy is the right thing in this moment. We have to do that by getting civics back in the classroom. And we do that in an action-oriented way, so it's not just Schoolhouse Rock, if you will, with all due respect to all of us who grew up learning that. So it's not I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. We are teaching young people how government works by directly engaging with government. We do that here in New York and then in our 5 other sites around the country.
But where do they, if they have an interface with your group, where are they getting their information about government and democracy?
They're getting it online, right? They're deciding how does government work, and can their voice be heard by reading the newspapers, by directly engaging with social media. And so we need to meet the young people where they are. A big part of the way that we do our work is for young people to actually not just learn those nuts and bolts of how the government work, but to pick a local problem in their community that they care about, and how can they address that problem systemically over the course of the semester by directly contacting government, contacting the media, and making a case for that issue. Because we know if we teach them how to get those skills and apply them to the real world, it will make it more likely for them to engage with it. We like to say that democracy is a full contact sport. You can't just put it up on the shelf and hope that it's going to come to you. We have to teach young people that government is there and accessible to them, and that's how we're going to begin to strengthen our democracy.
Jeremy, you talk about the power in our society at present. It's a new form of power that operates more like a current and less like currency. What exactly does that mean?
Well, terrific to be here as well. I mean, we think of the current moment we're in with the Me Too movement and Harvey Weinstein, I think, as 2 very different ways to think about the exercise of power, right? So we think of Weinstein as exercising old power, right? So for decades, he sees power as a currency, he hoards that power, he divvies up favor, he divvies up retributions. That's his model, right? That's how he operates. And what I think is so fascinating about Me Too is how different that looks, right? No one can hoard the power that is represented in that movement. Instead, it's really operating like a current, right? So we call that new power. And what that means is it's crossing geographies, it's crossing industries. There were people who helped to originate this movement, but no one owns that movement now, right? And so it's a very different way to think about what's happening and what's changing in the world. And I think the big question is, how do we harness that kind of power? Because I think Donald Trump, for better or worse, actually understands power both as currency and as current, right? Yeah. And that's a real problem.
Well, but that gives rise to the question, if new power operates like a current, I mean, is there any kind of electrical grid that's being built for something like this, right? I mean, and there are a number of movements that are basically hashtag movements, whether it's Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and they have this incredible unharnessed broad power, but nobody's been able to sort of seize on it to create policy, for example.
Right, and so this is, I think, the big challenge, right? We have a bunch of people who are incredibly good at creating those currents, right? We have others who understand institutions. and how to make those institutions work and how to manage elites and all of those things. And what we really need to do is bring those things together, right? So it's that ecosystem. You almost think of it as a race and there's a relay, right, where what some of those new power forces can do is raise the salience of the issue, right? So the Black Lives Matter movement has done far more to elevate the issues of racial justice and criminal justice in this country than any traditional organization has done for decades, right? Now, that ecosystem that needs to be built is that is carried on into policy development, policy change. And that doesn't always happen, partly because those new power forces and those old power forces aren't working together.
Right.
They're suspicious of each other, whereas actually we all kind of need to be bilingual in these two kinds of power.
I do want to ask, when we talk about harnessing power, the old and the new, Heather, one of the things that both sides need to agree on in any democracy is information and a set of facts. And I think for people who are just standing by and looking at the moment we're in, one of the most concerning things is that there seems to be a bifurcation in terms of information and facts. And I will point here to the advent of fake news. Do you think there is a way to get both sides to the table to agree upon the basic information that will then be used to craft policy, establish a more responsive democracy?
Well, in a sense, we're all Foucaultians now. We kind of
Can you just talk a little closer?
Oh, sorry. We're all Foucaultians now. We all have a sort of a cynical view of knowledge as power and are fairly relativist, I think, in our concepts of the truth. That having been said, I think that the model of testing opinion in a forum of debate still remains the best way to try and both reach consensus, if possible. It may be that there are certain pre-rational political and ideological commitments that are simply unbridgeable. But I think we need to hope that in an environment of open debate and testing evidence against other evidence, testing arguments against the evidence, we can arrive at some shared consensus about truth. The scientific revolution was one of the greatest accomplishments of civilization. The idea of formulating hypotheses, randomized controlled experiments to test things. This has given us unbelievable scientific, technological prowess and progress. And I think that kind of model should still apply. Obviously, in this world that has been discussed today of a vastly frisky internet and powerful internet, it's hard to find those forums where people will engage. It is indisputably the case that we see a polarization of opinion centers with people gravitating towards the media outlets that reflect their own views of the world. But I think that still our democracy does remain strong. It's easy to talk about disenfranchisement, say, but the feeling of disenfranchisement is not the same thing as being disenfranchisement. We continue to have the orderly transition of power of one political party to the next. That is something we should not take for granted. So I think that it is too soon to despair that the reasoned debate and testing of ideas is not making its way slowly but surely into public policy.
Can I just push back on that a little bit? Because if we talk about this in the context of the 2016 election, there were a number of televised presidential debates, right? I mean, you can argue that they were reasoned or not, but the fact of the matter is you had millions of Americans tuning into what was supposed to be a fairly serious debate, and yet there was so much disagreement about basic facts and also who was giving accurate information to the American public and who subsequently won the debate. When you watched that unfold, did that make you, what was your thinking about that kind of debate?
Well, I don't know if there was any more agreement over the now sort of landmark Douglas-Lincoln debates. Americans have been divided very, very profoundly for decades, if not centuries. And it remained up to the American public. Again, Mr. Barrara made the absolute essential point that we can still vote. There was no final tribunal to say who had the best side of things, but there was certainly a lot of fact-checking. One would like moderators to be a little more assertive and not allow people to scurry away from questions. But still, I would say that as possibly deficient in the level of soaring rhetoric and eloquence those debates were, they did give people, I think, a fairly accurate representation of where the candidates stood on the issues. And it remained with the voters to make their decisions. And with better turnout, we may have different outcomes. But again, nothing is now blocking people from making their own opinions, gathering their own facts, and attempting to resolve those disputes themselves and engaging civically to the extent they can with those results.
Trevor, when we talk about nefarious forces that are undermining democracy, money is something that is discussed a lot. You have worked a lot on the issue of money in politics. I would, again, point you to the 2016 election where folks say, well, Donald Trump beat people like Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton who had much deeper pockets. How do you explain that? How do you explain a candidate like Trump in a climate where you have multi-million-dollar super PACs supporting so many other candidates who go on to lose?
Well, a couple points on that. To start with, remember that the point of the money, the reason for the money, is to buy the ability to communicate. Donald Trump is the first billionaire who ran for president. He did finance his primary campaign largely himself. But if you look at the value of the time he got, it far exceeded the amount of money that was raised and spent by his opponents. I recall vividly a New York Times article in probably April of the election year, so before we'd even seen the summer. And it rated the number of minutes that Donald Trump was on television and what it would have cost a candidate to do that. Earned media. And he was at $2 billion worth of free television time, and the nearest competitor was Hillary Clinton at $600 million. So the people give you money, you spend money to reach voters. If you have the ability, because you are Donald Trump and you are a news story and you are enough of an oddity that everyone thinks their ratings are going to go up if they cover you, then you don't actually need to spend as much. There was a line in the middle of 2016 by the president of CBS speaking publicly, and he said, Donald Trump may be bad for the country, but he's great for CBS, meaning ratings went up when he was on. And so that is a clever way, but I think for democracy, a dangerous way of short-circuiting the system, because if you are such a dominant figure that the press either feels they have to cover you or they want to cover you for ratings purposes, how does somebody else compete with that? That I think becomes a problem. If I could turn and address the point that was being made that we still have the right to vote and therefore can make a difference, I think that is another factor we need to look carefully at, because we are in an environment where the right to vote for some citizens is being challenged. We have these voter ID laws coming across the country that make it harder for specific targeted segments of the population to go out and vote. There are now 3 courts in Texas, federal district courts, that have found that the Texas voter ID law, which allowed certain types of IDs that Republicans might have, like concealed weapons IDs, to give you the right to vote, but did not allow IDs from, state-issued IDs from universities. So you have in states across the country an effort to target voters of the other party who are often the poor, the elderly, people who don't have a driver's license because they live in an urban area. And what we're finding is that actually diminishes the number of voters. There are estimates that say there were 200,000 voters in Wisconsin who could not vote in 2016 because they didn't have IDs. You might recall that state was decided by a lot less.
Yeah, DeNora, on that end, people will say anecdotally, oh, it's not that hard to get a driver's license. It's not that hard to get the ID that you need to vote. In your experience with young people, how much of it is a barrier to getting young people especially, to the voting booth?
I think it's partially the barrier that Trevor pointed to of the structural barriers to participation. So can they actually register to vote? Do they understand the process? In a city like New York, where most people don't drive, do they actually have a state-issued ID? I think it is also the civic participation barrier of, will my vote actually matter? Are there things that I could be doing that are more effective, more impactful to this notion of movements? Am I tweeting or liking, or as I like to say, hugging things on the internet, and that's going to be more effective than actually voting? And does my voice matter, right? So you have the structural barriers, voting, campaign finance reform laws, et cetera, redistricting for that matter, and then you have the civic participation barriers of, like, if I actually know what to do and I know why it would matter to vote, do I think it's worth my time to register to vote? Because I'm going to have an influence in shaping outcomes in elections.
Jamie, I wonder if Donald Trump, in the context of all of this, hasn't actually given the country, just bear with me as I say this, given the country a gift with his Twitter feed, insofar as it is the first time you are seeing a president speak so immediately, so in such an unvarnished fashion to the American public. It creates some weird connective tissue, though it may be on social media, between the highest office in the land and anybody with the internet. Anything there?
No, it's a provocative argument, Alex.
Just putting it out there.
No, but I think there's something in that, right? I mean, it tells us something about a candidate with a better agenda and how they might communicate, right? Because people now are so hungry for participation, right? They don't just want these sort of elevated traditional leaders on pedestals, right? And so what Trump does in a way is he both elevates himself and he goes right down into the gutter as well. Now, I think it's possible, the part of the Hillary Clinton challenge was the way she engaged with people was, very removed. So for people to harness these new tools, right, they actually have to really empower their crowds. So what Trump did so cleverly was, most traditional politicians try to rein in their supporters, right? They try to rein in the extremes. They distance themselves from those people. What Trump recognized was that all the energy would come if he unleashed the creativity of his most radical supporters. So those white supremacists, instead of saying, I distance myself from you, he retweets them, right? Instead of, distancing himself from the people in his rallies who go too far, he says, I'll pay your legal fees if you beat someone up, right? And the signal that sends in a kind of new power world is, I want you as my supporters to be creative. I'm going to be in this mutually constitutive relationship with you. And when you do something really interesting and creative, when you come up with that killer meme about Hillary Clinton, I will actually elevate your voice, right?
Do you think in that way, Heather, that he has created a new model?
Yes, it's quite remarkable, and in many ways it looks, as you frame it, both Jeremy and Alex, I think very insightfully, as almost a repudiation of the founders' vision, which was not direct democracy, it was republicanism, and I think they were worried about the demagogic potential of direct democracy, where the mob is immediately connected to the demagogue. And so we have here with this very visceral direct connection, and I actually have not followed Trump's Twitter feed before, but I wanted to check some recent controversy, and it was an amazing experience to go and see. This is coming from the presidency. It's very, very
bizarre. It's like
bizarre.
You're the Rip Van Winkle of Twitter. You just checked in on Trump's Twitter feed. Congratulations to you, my friend.
I haven't signed up yet, though. But yes, I mean, it is, I think, there is a risk here that we render that sort of filtering of thought and opinion that the founders wanted, which was through a fairly elaborate system of creating representative government, into something that is much more emotional and emotive. And we'll see where this ends up, but it is a very different model.
Trevor, really quickly, just as we close this out, you talk about money in politics, you can either have a lot of money or you can be a very colorful character. But either way, you're competing for airtime, and that's what is potentially going to decide the race. So maybe the most nefarious influence of money is pushing more character-driven politicians into the race.
Well, I think what we're seeing with money, first of all, you have to differentiate between the presidential election and what's happening in Congress. And today we have this extraordinary spectacle of Republican members of both houses saying, we have to pass this tax bill because our donors are demanding it, and they have said they will not fund us until we pass it. So you look at that as a direct connection between money, members of Congress, and votes. And you say, no wonder the 99% of the country that isn't in that conversation feels that they are not only left out, but that the result is something they're not going to like, that they weren't the drivers of that. And I think when you look at money in Congress, you see a much more insidious connection than you do with money at the presidential race, where it is largely communication. In Congress, it is access, influence, and apparently direct results in votes.
The agenda itself is shaped. We have to leave it there. I'm sorry we're a little over, but stay tuned. There's more to come. Thank you to my esteemed panel.